Ambrose's grip on my arm was hard enough to bruise, and the carriage waiting beyond the garden wall was close enough that I could hear the horses shifting, restless, in the dark. "You will get in quietly," he said, "and you will not make this harder than it already is. I am considerably better at making things hard than you have given me credit for," I said, and drove my heel down onto his instep with everything I had. And it was in the half-second his grip loosened that I heard, somewhere behind the garden wall, a sound no ordinary night should have contained. A king's wolf, fully loosed, tearing toward us faster than anything with that much weight should have been able to move. I did not know yet whether Magnus would reach me before Ambrose's men recovered enough to drag me the rest of the way to that carriage. I only knew I was not getting in it without a fight. Let me tell you how I ended up in that garden. Because it started 9 days earlier. In a hall filled with 200 omegas, dressed for a night I had spent 3 weeks being coached to survive quietly, not win. I was 23, and I had not wanted to attend the selection at all. My parents had died when I was 12, leaving me to my Uncle Ambrose's guardianship, along with a modest inheritance he had, I would later learn, spent down to almost nothing within a handful of years. I did not know that yet, standing in a fitting room 3 weeks before the selection, while he explained, in the reasonable tone of a man delivering unwelcome news as though it were simple practicality, that I would be attending as our house's entrant, and that I was to keep my head down, draw no attention, and allow myself to be eliminated in the earliest possible round. "The king does not need to notice you," he told me, more than once, adjusting the plain grey cut of a gown chosen specifically. I understood even then to blend into a hall full of women wearing considerably brighter things. "You need only survive it quietly and come home." I did not question it deeply at the time. I had no more desire to become queen than Ambrose apparently had for me to try, and the arrangement suited us both, or so I believed. The 3 weeks before the selection were spent in a blur of fittings and instructions I mostly tuned out. How to curtsy without drawing the eye. How to answer a king's question briefly enough that he moved on to the next candidate quickly. How to stand so that my presence registered as decoration rather than person. I remember thinking, more than once, that Ambrose seemed almost proud of how thoroughly I was learning to disappear, as though he had raised me specifically for this one skill and was finally seeing it pay off. I did not resent the coaching at the time. I had spent 11 years in that man's house learning, in smaller ways, that being unremarkable kept the peace, and the selection simply seemed like the largest stage that particular lesson had ever demanded. The night of the selection, 200 of us stood in a receiving hall that smelled of hothouse flowers and nervous perfume, each pinned with a single white bloom marking us as candidates. While King Magnus of Aldmere walked the line slowly, pausing before each woman just long enough for courtesy. Moving on before anyone could mistake courtesy for interest. I did not perform for him the way I watched the women around me perform. I had been told to be forgettable. And forgettable, I had decided somewhere in that receiving hall, meant simply not participating in whatever theatre the rest of the room seemed to consider mandatory. I kept my eyes on the great doors at the far end of the hall, calculating, out of pure habit, exactly how long it would take to reach them if the whole evening became unbearable. I did not notice him stop in front of me until the room had gone entirely silent. I looked up. King Magnus was standing directly before me, closer than he had stood before any of the women preceding me, and something in his face had shifted from polite obligation into an attention so sudden and total that I felt it land in my chest like a struck bell. "You were not watching me," he said, quiet, almost to himself. "I was watching the door," I said, before I had fully decided honesty was the wise choice, Your Grace. I apologize if that was rude. I did not realize courtesy required constant eye contact. Something moved behind his eyes that I did not have a name for yet. Startled, unguarded, the particular expression of a man who has spent an entire evening being looked at by 200 women and has just for the first time been genuinely seen looking away. His wolf did the rest of the deciding before he apparently finished doing it himself. I felt it more than saw it, a shift in the air around him, and then he was reaching for my hand, not with the practiced formality he had shown every woman before me, but with something considerably less composed, his own control visibly slipping in front of the entire assembled hall. "I would like you to stay," he said, "after the others have gone." The hall did not merely go quiet. It went the particular silence that precedes gossip loud enough to reach every corner of the kingdom by morning. I did not want to stay. I want that on the record plainly, because it makes everything that came after considerably more complicated than a simple fairy tale. I had come to that hall with exactly one goal, quietly, forgettably failing to be chosen, and the one man in the kingdom whose attention I had spent 3 weeks being coached to avoid had just chosen me in front of everyone. I found my uncle's face in the crowd before I found any words of my own, and understood, watching the colour drain entirely from it, that whatever had just happened to me had happened to him considerably worse. Wistan, the king's second, found me the following morning, in the modest chamber I had been given overnight, studying me with the particular careful expression of a man attempting to assess a puzzle he had not expected the evening to hand him. "You did not want to be chosen," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," I said. "I would like that noted plainly, in case anyone here intends to hold my presence against me as ambition. I was told to be forgettable. I do not know what I did wrong." "You did nothing wrong," Wistan said. "The king has sat through 2 prior selection ceremonies his council forced upon him and shown genuine interest in exactly no one. I do not believe you did anything wrong at all." I did not fully believe him, not yet, but I found myself considerably less afraid of the conversation than I had expected to be. Magnus came to see me himself that same afternoon, and I understood, watching him enter that small chamber with none of the practiced formality he had worn through the entire receiving line the night before, exactly how much that performance had cost him. "I owe you an apology," he said, without preamble. "I did not intend to make a spectacle of you in front of 200 witnesses. I am not entirely certain what came over me." "You are the king," I said. "I would have thought spectacle was simply the shape of your ordinary Tuesday." Something flickered across his face, brief and startled, the closest thing to a genuine laugh I would come to learn he allowed himself easily. "Most of my ordinary Tuesdays involve considerably less honesty than you offered me last night. I have sat through an entire evening of women telling me precisely what they believed I wanted to hear. You told me you were watching the door." I was. "Why?" he asked, and it was, I understood, the real question beneath everything else he had not yet said. "Because I did not want to be there," I said, plainly, because there seemed little use in pretending otherwise now that the damage of honesty had already been done. I was told to attend, told to be forgettable, and told to come home the moment I was eliminated. I have no interest in a crown, Your Grace. I am sorry if that is not the answer a king wants from the woman his wolf just chose in front of his entire court." He was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the last of its careful formality. "It is, I think, the only answer that has ever actually interested me. Every other woman in that hall wanted the crown badly enough to perform for it. You wanted the exit badly enough to look for it in the middle of your own possible coronation. I find I cannot stop thinking about what that says about you." "What does it say?" I asked, "in your own accounting of it?" "That you were the only honest thing in that entire hall," he said. "I have sat through 2 selections, now surrounded by women reciting rehearsed answers about duty and devotion. and I have never once believed a single word of it. You told me, without meaning to flatter me at all, that you wanted to leave. I have wanted to leave every formal event I have attended since my father died and left me this crown. I did not expect to find that particular exhaustion answered back to me by a candidate in a receiving line. I am not certain that qualifies as romantic, I said. No, he agreed, something warmer moving beneath the words now. It qualifies as the first true thing anyone in this castle has said to me in longer than I care to admit. I find I would like to hear more of them, if you would allow it. I did not answer him plainly that afternoon. I only agreed, cautiously, to stay through the formal claiming period rather than ask to be released early, and told myself it was simple curiosity rather than anything more complicated. I did not entirely believe myself even as I said it. I remained at Aldmere considerably longer than either of us said aloud that it meant anything, because the formal claiming period gave both of us weeks before any final decision needed to be made, and because I found, with some private embarrassment, that I did not want to leave nearly as urgently as I had wanted to on the night I arrived. Those first days settled into a rhythm I had not expected to enjoy. Magnus, once free of the receiving line's performance, turned out to be considerably drier and more observant than the careful, composed king the rest of his court seemed to know. He found me in the castle library most afternoons, where I had taken to reading simply because it gave me a reason to sit quietly without anyone requiring conversation of me, and more often than not, he joined me without asking, content to read across from me for an hour without either of us feeling any need to fill the silence. "You do not perform for me here either," he observed once, watching me turn a page without looking up. "I confess I find it restful in a way I did not expect quiet to be. I am not certain I know how to perform," I said. Ambrose spent considerably more effort teaching me how to disappear. "Then I am glad his effort failed as thoroughly as it did," he said, and I felt something in my chest warm at hearing it, though I was not yet ready to examine that warmth too closely. Ambrose visited twice in the first week, each time pulling me aside with increasing agitation, insisting I find some polite reason to withdraw before the claiming became final. I did not understand his urgency, not fully. Not yet, I assumed, at the time. Simple discomfort at a niece he had never expected to rise above quiet obscurity, suddenly standing at the centre of court attention. "You do not belong here," he told me, the second time, gripping my wrist tighter than the words alone accounted for. "You were never meant to be looked at like this. Withdraw before the king realises his mistake and does it for you." "He does not seem to consider it a mistake," I said, pulling free. "I am beginning to wonder why you are so certain he should." He had no answer ready for that, only a tightening around his eyes I mistook, at the time, for simple embarrassment, rather than the beginning of panic. If you want to find out whether my uncle's reasons for wanting me forgettable were as simple as he claimed, and what Magnus's wolf did the night everything finally came apart, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along, so you do not lose the thread of what happens when a king who has never been chosen honestly finally is. It was Wystan, going through the household's outstanding correspondence at Magnus's request, who found the truth of it. Ambrose owed a considerable debt to Lord Kestrel of the Eastern Holdings, accumulated over several years of poor management and worse decisions, and had, 6 months earlier, quietly agreed to settle that debt by promising my hand to Kestrel the moment I was eliminated from the selection. As an unremarkable niece no one else would think to claim, the arrangement depended entirely on my failing quietly and coming home exactly as instructed. My sudden, very public, very undeniable selection by the king himself had not merely embarrassed him. It had made the debt considerably harder to settle at all, and Kestrel, I gathered from the correspondence, was not a patient creditor. I sat with that discovery a long time, understanding, with the particular cold clarity of a fact rearranging everything around it, that every instruction Ambrose had given me before the selection had never once been about my own comfort or safety. It had been about a debt I had not known existed, paid with a future I had not known was already sold. I thought back, sitting with those letters, to a dozen small moments across the years that suddenly rearranged themselves into something considerably less innocent than I had assumed at the time. The way he had steered me away from any suitor who showed genuine interest, the careful attention he paid to keeping my dowry technically intact, while quietly bleeding every other part of the estate dry. The particular relief in his face each time I agreed to another instruction without question. I had spent 11 years believing myself unremarkable by nature. I understood now, reading his own handwriting laid out plainly on the page, that I had simply been kept that way on purpose. Something in me that had spent 9 days simply enduring my own strange new circumstance stopped enduring quietly. I brought the correspondence to Magnus myself. His face, reading it, went colder than I had yet seen it. He arranged to sell you, he said, the moment my counsel forced this selection on me, and I very nearly ruined his plan without knowing I was doing it. He will not simply accept losing that debt settlement, I said. Kestrel will not either. Then we will not give either of them the chance to fix what my choice broke. His jaw set in the particular way I had learned, over those 9 days, meant a decision had already been made, and simply needed carrying out. I am done letting my counsel, or your uncle, or anyone else decide what happens to people who have already decided things for themselves. I brought the letters to Magnus that same evening I found them, and watched him read every damning line twice, his jaw tightening further with each pass. I owe you an apology of my own now, he said quietly, once he had finished. I chose you in that hall because something in me recognized something true in you. I did not know, choosing you, that I was also pulling you directly into the path of a debt you had no part in creating. You did not put me in that path, I said. My uncle did, years before either of us ever stood in that receiving hall. You simply made it impossible for him to finish what he started quietly. Then let us make certain he cannot finish it loudly either, he said, and I watched. Not for the first time. The particular steadiness that settled over him whenever a decision had been made, and only the doing of it remained. Ambrose moved first, and moved with considerably more desperation than careful planning, once he realized the claiming period was drawing toward its formal conclusion without any sign I intended to withdraw. He went before the selection council directly, claiming I had concealed a prior betrothal to disqualify me on a technicality older than the ceremony itself, a lie transparent enough that Whiston disproved it within a single afternoon of records, but delivered publicly enough to cost me several days of whispered court speculation about my honesty, regardless of the outcome. Magnus dismissed the claim the moment Whiston's records reached him, publicly, in front of the same council Ambrose had approached, which I suspect told my uncle, plainly, exactly how little room his schemes now had left to maneuver. I should have known, watching that panic settle into something colder in his eyes, that he was not a man who accepted losing quietly. I had spent 11 years learning his moods well enough to read the difference between his ordinary irritation and the particular stillness he wore when he had decided a problem required more drastic handling. I saw that stillness the evening after the council dismissed his claim, and I did not think enough of it at the time to change my habits. His final move came 6 nights later, in the castle's east garden, where I had gone alone after supper for the kind of quiet I still, even now, occasionally craved after a lifetime of learning to disappear. That is the scene I told you about at the very start of this, his hand hard on my arm, the carriage waiting beyond the garden wall, my heel coming down on his instep with every bit of strength I had left in me. Ambrose's men recovered from my elbow and my kicking heels faster than I had hoped, and I was half dragged toward that waiting carriage, Kestrel's own crest visible on its door in the moonlight, when Magnus's wolf cleared the garden wall in a single motion that sent two of Ambrose's men scattering before it had even fully landed. It did not simply subdue them. It put itself bodily between me and that carriage, teeth bared, low and furious, while Magnus himself, arriving a half-second behind his own wolf, hauled Ambrose off me with a grip considerably less gentle than courtesy required. "You sold her," Magnus said, his voice gone very quiet and very dangerous, "to settle your own debts, and then tried to steal her back the moment my claim on her threatened your arrangement. I would very much like to know why I should not simply let my wolf finish what it clearly intends to." "She was never meant to be chosen," Ambrose said, still struggling, panic finally cracking through whatever composure he had managed until that moment. "The debt required only that she be eliminated. None of this was meant to happen." "And yet it did," I said, stepping free of the last loosened grip his men still held, my voice steadier than I expected it to be given how hard my heart was still working. "I was never yours to trade, Uncle. I was never forgettable either, no matter how carefully you tried to dress me as though I were. You simply never once bothered to look." He had no answer ready for that. I do not think he had ever, in the whole of my life, expected me to say it aloud. Wistan arrived moments later with enough of the castle guard behind him to make certain no one attempted a second approach that night, and I remember sitting on the cold garden stones afterward, my whole body shaking with the particular delayed fear that only arrives once the danger has actually passed, while Magnus knelt beside me, saying nothing at all, simply present. The way I had learned over those 9 days was the truest thing he knew how to offer. Kestrel's men, waiting beyond the garden wall for a delivery that was clearly no longer coming, retreated the moment Magnus's guard reached the scene in full, and word came within days that Kestrel himself had disavowed the entire arrangement, rather than be publicly named in a scheme to steal a king's chosen candidate. Ambrose was stripped of his guardianship and his standing that same night. His debts examined in full by the Crown's own accountants, and he was escorted from Aldmere's grounds by morning, with considerably less dignity than he had worn arranging my future behind my back for the better part of a year. Magnus found me afterward in that same garden, holding the single white selection bloom I had let wilt on purpose in the 9 days since the ceremony, refusing every offer to replace it with a fresh one. "I have spent 9 days trying to prove to you that being chosen did not have to mean being owned by someone else's plans," he said. "I do not think nearly losing you to a carriage in my own garden was the demonstration I had intended." "It worked anyway," I said, "though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it." He looked at the wilted bloom still in my hand, then at me, something in his face finally losing the last of its careful, practiced formality. "I do not know how to court a woman who wanted the exit more than the crown. I have spent 9 days trying to work out what would actually convince you to stay." "You already worked it out," I said. "You listened when I told you the truth instead of punishing me for it. That is the only thing you ever needed to do." When he kissed me, careful and certain, a man who had spent 2 prior selections performing obligation and had finally found someone who offered him nothing but honesty instead, I felt something in my chest. Some old, careful smallness I had built specifically to survive being unwanted finally let itself go. He claimed me before the full court a month later, his hand steady on the old iron circlet as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had watched him walk past 200 eager candidates to stop in front of the one woman looking for the door. Wiston stood near the front of that hall, looking, for the first time since I had met him, entirely unworried. Not every voice in that hall welcomed it easily. One elderly duchess remarked, loudly enough to be overheard on purpose, that a queen who had openly wanted to leave her own coronation ceremony seemed a curious choice for a king's household. Magnus answered her himself, plainly, before I had even decided whether the comment deserved a response at all. that a woman honest enough to want the exit had proven, in the months since, considerably more devoted to this crown and its people than any candidate who had merely performed devotion for one evening. The Duchess did not raise the subject again. 6 months later, I stood in that same garden with a letter from a distant cousin in one hand and a fresh white bloom, deliberately kept alive this time, pinned at my collar in the other. The letter asked, carefully, whether it was true that Ambrose's niece, the quiet one, the forgettable one, no one in the family had ever expected much from, was Queen of Aldmere now. I wrote back that it was true, and that forgettable had simply never been the word anyone should have used. Wystan had stopped bracing every time Ambrose's name came up in court proceedings, mostly now that the man's debts and his standing both sat in ruin, rather than at court. The selection process itself, at Magnus's own insistence, had been formally revised before the season's end. Stripped of the performance and pageantry that had once rewarded exactly the kind of theatre I had refused to offer. And Aldmere's court, once so certain a queen had to arrive already knowing how to be watched, had quietly gotten used to the idea that mine had arrived trying hardest to be seen by no one at all. I had taken, in those 6 months, to sitting in on the newly revised selection council whenever it met, if only to make certain no future candidate was ever again coached, the way I had been, to disappear for someone else's convenience. Magnus said once, watching me argue a particularly stubborn point with 2 of his oldest advisors, that he had never expected marrying the quiet candidate would result in the loudest voice at his council table. I told him he should have read the room better on the night he chose me. He said, without hesitation, that he had, better than anyone else in that hall had managed all evening. I touched the fresh bloom at my collar and thought about the woman who had stood in that receiving hall 9 months earlier, calculating the fastest route to the exit, certain of nothing except that she did not want to be chosen. She had no idea, that ordinary anxious evening, that looking away from every performance in that hall was about to become the exact thing that made her impossible to overlook. She only knew she was tired of pretending to want something she did not. I like to think she would be glad, now that she never learned to perform for a room that was not truly looking at her. Do you think Magnus would have chosen me if I had smiled and performed the way every other candidate did? Or was some part of him already tired of being wanted for the wrong reasons? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if you want to stay in this garden a little longer, comment the bloom, and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for standing at that door with me, wherever you are listening from tonight. Welcome to Aldmere. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills who are tired of being chosen for the wrong reasons, waiting for someone who simply is not performing at all, and I intend to tell you every one of their stories.